Hi there, I'm Jo Frost. On the evening of March 3rd, 33-year-old Sarah Everard was walking back from visiting her bubble near Clapham, but she never made it home. After a national search, her remains were discovered in a builder's bag in a wood near Ashford in Kent. And Met Police officer Wayne Cousin was arrested on suspicion of her kidnapping and subsequently of her murder. Her abduction and murder has set off an extraordinary outpouring of both anger and of grief. Protests on Clapham Common bandstand and at Westminster have followed, as well as mass coverage in the media and in the Commons. The phrase that seems to sum up people's shock and anger is simply, "She was just walking home." Joining me today for a conversation around violence against women and the role of the church in speaking into and changing culture is Bekah Legg, CEO of Restored, and Jo Evans, advocacy researcher with the EA. Welcome to you both. Bekah, why don't we start with you? Actually, no, let's start with Jo. Jo, let's start with you. Share us your context. Say where you are and why this story specifically is of such interest to you.
Yeah. I'm, like you said, I'm Jo Evans. I'm an advocacy researcher at the Evangelical Alliance. And as of January, I've been living in Balham in South London with my husband, Tom. And this story struck me so much because I didn't hear about it first on the news. Out of my window a couple of Saturdays ago, I saw presumably friends of Sarah Everard putting up posters on my street because she disappeared. A 5-minute walk from where I live, sort of just around the corner. So it's felt very, very close, and with that, just very real.
So it's right in your community, it's right where you are. How is that manifesting around your friends, your community? What's it like around Balham at the moment?
I think for me personally, it's been very, I think I can quite easily distance myself from, you can read horrific stories on the news every day. And I think there is some wisdom to not letting those overwhelm you, not feeling the weight of those every day. But this one I really did, because it was so close, so vivid in that way. So that's how it kind of affected me personally, but that can't be the only reason why it struck such a chord, because every single girl I know and follow on social media were posting things from when it was first put on the news. People were sharing missing posters, and then there was just an outpouring of anger and sadness that this thing that we were all aware of but never put a name to, of feeling afraid when walking around, when walking home, it suddenly just blew up in the news. So everyone was sharing, we've all walked home with keys in our hands. Everyone was sharing how to turn on emergency SOS on our iPhones. Everyone was sharing different supermarkets that have said that they're a safe space. It just felt like the lid had opened on this collective feeling of fear that we might all have had but have never talked about.
And Bekah, you are CEO of Restored. Tell us a little bit more about Restored, about the work that you do, but also the conversations that you've been having over the last couple of weeks.
Well, Restored's a Christian organisation that was set up just over 10 years ago to respond to the realities of violence against women around the world. And it started after the founders had sat in a UN AIDS conference of all places, but they'd heard story after story of women who were HIV positive because they'd been subjected to violence, they'd been sexually abused, they'd been raped, and they felt this God call on them and on their life to do something about it, and to help the church fundamentally to do something about it. And so that's the heart of what we do. We speak up about violence against women, and we critically equip the church to recognise where it exists within the church and to end domestic abuse. But as an organisation, we've been listening to the stories. It's just so sad when you hear the story of what happened to Sarah Everard. It hits a chord. But then watching this groundswell as this reality of actually, just what Joe was saying there about the reality of people finally saying, do you know what? I'm scared. I walk home with my phone ready to hit, with 99, ready to hit the last 9. I come home with my keys between my fingers. I had this situation where I was followed and I was frightened. And as this all came out, we were seeing, on across social media, what we already are really aware of as an organisation, but beginning to see more and more people coming to know about it. And I think it was, it was this moment when actually suddenly people began to say, what can we do? What can we do? And really critically, and one of the things that I've taken away as a real positive of the last few weeks is just how many men actually were saying, well, what can we do? We're not a threat, we're not dangerous, but we recognise that actually there are things that we can do to help and to turn the situation around. And I think that's a brilliant thing.
So this is one incident, this is one woman, and it has sparked something. What do we do to the conversations that saying this is really rare, this is really unusual, that it's a bit of a media frenzy a little bit at the moment? How do we frame the conversation to at least address, do we have a problem as a culture, as a society, when it comes to violence against women? How do we share our experiences and frame the story? Bekah, let's start with you.
I think one of the things we have to acknowledge is that it is rare for what happened to Sarah Everard to happen. Like, it just is. Cressida Dick was on the television trying to reassure everybody, saying, this is really unlikely to happen. You are okay to walk home no late at night because, it's unlikely that someone's going to abduct you and murder you. And that's correct. But the truth is, these fears and these stories and these experiences that women are sharing all across social media and on the news and with their friends and with their husbands and dads and everybody else, they're also true. And the reason women are afraid isn't because the likelihood is that if they walk out in the dark, they'll get murdered. It's because there are smaller things happening all of the time. And I think one of the things that kind of created this groundswell of emotion over the last couple of weeks is about the smaller things. And we had 2 big bits of research released in the same week that we discovered that Sarah Everard's body was discovered. And one of those pieces of research was from the World Health Organization. And they discovered that 1 in 4 women globally will be physically or sexually abused by their husband or their boyfriend. Now, that's an enormous amount of women hurt and abused by the men that are meant to love them. There's a reality to women needing to be afraid, not just on the streets, but at home. But out on the streets, it really isn't safe. Another report came out from the UN Women, and they said that actually in the UK, 97% of young women aged 18 to 24 will be sexually harassed in public. Now that's not a might be, that's not a rarely happens. That's almost every woman that you know will be sexually harassed. And that's everything from a wolf whistle, which, sometimes we think, well, that's not so bad, but we'll come back to that in a minute. But it's everything through to being followed home, to being groped in a corner, to being forced into doing something that you didn't ever want to do. That's 97%. And when you get that in your mind, it begins to make more sense that actually this isn't a moment of hysteria. It's not a gross overreaction. One story has ignited all these other things, and it's those things that sit underneath that make women say, actually, I don't know when the wolf whistle will become more. I don't know when hearing that man walking behind me making a comment is going to turn into something bigger. And so the fear is real, and it's justified.
Joe, what's your experience? You were sharing just now about people sharing safety tips and their experiences of walking home with the keys in the hand, and we have all done it. But those stats, that 97%, that 1 in 4, those are real women. How do we, what have those experiences look like, and how do we journey with those women in these times?
Yeah, I think something that really struck me very early on that I feel like is important to say is that I felt scared, and suddenly, with all this coming to light, suddenly untrusting when I went out for a jog in the early evening. And actually, I'm in such a position of privilege. I have lovely male figures in my life. I have a lovely dad. I have a lovely husband who are great allies of women. But actually, so even though I'm in quite a safe, comfortable position, I see it all around me. I think I'd be right in saying every woman that I know has a story. We've all been catcalled or whistled after or shouted after. I know girls who have had men they know touch them repeatedly at parties when they've not wanted them to, and they felt too awkward to kick up a fuss. I've had a friend who was walking home in London in broad daylight, and a man punched her in the jaw with keys in his hand. She managed to avoid serious injury because she has quick reflexes. I myself, again, the story was fine. But when I was 12, was chased by a man on a bike when I went out for a jog. We all have real experiences of these things. And Bekah hit the nail on the head of there are statistics to mean that we don't necessarily, we know that the statistics are in our favour, that the same thing that happened to Sarah isn't going to happen to us. Like the hashtag that's going around, we know it's not all men. But you never know who, you never know when. And just those feelings building to knowing that it shouldn't be this way and it's not right. But getting to that point of, but actually on a practical level, when I'm walking home, what can I do? What power do I have to change that?
Yeah. And I think it's important to recognise as well that actually it's not just that we're scared of being murdered. It's not nice. It's like the other things aren't nice either. They're frightening in and of themselves, aren't they? It's that thing of just going, it's not I've heard too many people go, oh, someone's wolf whistling, it's just a compliment. And you think, not really. Not really. And if somebody got known to me, that's just frightening. And if somebody says what they want to do to me, that's just horrid. It's just not nice. And sometimes we can make those things, we can minimize those things and make it like women should just put up with it. And actually, I don't think any of us want the women that we know and love to go through that. So we shouldn't want any woman to go through that.
And I found it, I was almost upset with myself that, like I said, I know so many friends with so many stories. I have stories. And yet I've never got really upset about it on kind of a big picture scale before, because it's almost so common that you just put up with it. It's just the fact of life of being a woman. And actually saying it's not okay, it's not right. And I think the fact there's so many, like I said, everyone I follow on social media came together to say this is wrong. I guess it's, what do we do now?
It's interesting. When the Me Too hashtag kicked off a few years ago, I was just reminiscing with my husband that I've lost count of how many friends I know who've been raped or sexually assaulted, not just harassed, but sexually assaulted. And horrific stories of incredibly close friends. And I was reminiscing to say, well, I've got so many people, but I don't have a Me Too story. And my husband, he looked at me, he was like, what do you mean you don't have a Me Too story? And I was like, I don't. He goes, Jo, you had to report your housemate onto the sexual offenders list because he broke into your bedroom naked and tried to get into bed with you. I was like, oh yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And I'd forgotten it because it was so normal. And it really shocked me because, Jo, I completely agree. We have tolerated and normalized this behavior. And as a culture, and this is kind of what I want to move on to, how do we take responsibility as a community, as a culture, to reflect and take stock of where we've got to and how we've got here so that we can work out how to change? Bekah, how do we do this? What is our responsibility in what's happened to women over the years?
I think that our responsibility is to do something. I think it can be very easy to get really angry or really emotional or really upset or to be really horrified. But actually, it's the next step that really matters, because otherwise we can have these moments, can't we, when we go, goodness me, how can such a thing happen? And then we move on and we forget and we start normalizing everything all over again. And, you know, there's a story in the Bible that is very like this moment. And there's a story in the Bible, and it's back in the book of Judges. It's a story that nobody ever talks about because it's so horrible. It's a story of a woman who's subjected to the most horrific, horrendous violence, precisely because she's a woman. She's almost sacrificed up to protect a man. And she's raped and abused all night and left for dead in the morning. But then her husband, and he's not a terribly nice man himself, but he takes her body and he chops it up and he sends it out to the various different tribes of Israel. And when the people receive these, what must have been really quite gruesome packages in the post, presumably, they all come together. And God's people at that point, their response was one of horror. And they say, paraphrase, but they say, you know, has such a thing ever been seen or heard? You know, never since we left Egypt. And they sit there and go, we've never seen anything like this. And the reality is that Israel had been descending into darkness and godlessness for years. And so the reality is the stories that come before it show us that actually women were being treated worse and worse and worse and worse in Israel. And actually probably there were all kinds of smaller things going on. But this one story, a little bit like Sarah Everard, brought them all together saying, this is outrageous. It brought them to the bandstand. And then the next sentence, which is what I've actually got written on my fridge, nobody else has, somebody did it specially for me, is they say this. They say, we must speak up and we must do something. And then they do. And what they do next is absolutely bloodthirsty. And I don't think it's what the church in 2021 should be doing at all. But essentially, they say we have to eradicate this in our culture. This has to stop. It has to end. It doesn't belong in God's kingdom. And they step up and they speak up and they do something. And I think there's this call on the church that we need to do the same. And not just by saying, oh, isn't it terrible? But by actually looking inwards, by looking at the things we say, the ways that actually we've allowed this toxic culture from the world to seep into our churches, sometimes even to seep into our theologies, even when we never intended it to, and to recognize it and call it out and be intentional about speaking up for women, speaking up about the way that we respect and honor and treat them, and the way that men and women can, you know, partner together and bring in God's kingdom on earth.
So good. So I've been reflecting on the fact that this cry against injustice, this cry for justice for women, is similar in one respect to the cry that emerged after the murder of George Floyd last year, that actually in this pandemic, in this season of lockdown, in this season where everything else has been stripped away, it's almost as if we have got the attention to be able to see what's in front of us, what we've maybe been blind to or blinded ourselves to in the past. So I suppose my question, Becca, let's start with you, is this for women, the George Floyd moment, is this a moment that we can see systemic and cultural change happen? Will the ripples move us beyond the bandstand? And if so, how do we keep that momentum going?
I hope so. I hope it's a moment like that. I think it's felt like one, but only history will tell is the truth. But the truth is, it can't move beyond the bandstand if we don't move ourselves. You know, this is reliant on, you know, to have a movement like that is a lot of people, but every movement starts with one person. It starts with us, and it starts just like the people of Israel all those years ago, with some people stepping up. And we've seen the beginnings here. We've seen similar things going on in Australia and around the world. And I hope, actually, my dream is that the church steps up. You know, when the church takes its place, fighting for justice, ending oppression, doing, you know, standing up, being light in the darkness, then we're doing God's work for him wherever we go. And I think we can do that. You know, I think it's so important, but actually nobody will leave the bandstand until the first person does. And I think that's on us. That's on us to lead the way.
Jo, what's your hope? What does change look like for you? And how can the church be a prophetic voice for that change, do you think?
Well, I mean, like Bekah referred to that story in Judges, God has something to say about this. I find it so encouraging the Bible talks about these things, because it says that means that we as Christians should be talking about these things. And like you said, Joe, so many people are crying out for justice and compassion, for women to be treated with equal respect and dignity, for women to feel safe. And who can answer those cries better than Jesus? Who can meet those needs better than he can? So I really hope that the church will be a strong voice in this against violence against women, because Christians should care more than anyone else. We know from Genesis that women are made in the image of God, that they have equal value and worth. We know from the accounts of Jesus' life that he treated women with equal dignity and respect. We know that he hated oppression, cruelty, and injustice. And we can speak of Jesus, who knows the human experience, and he meets us with unending compassion. Jesus knows what it's like to be mistreated verbally and physically through no fault of his own. We see that at the cross. He understands what people who've experienced this have been through. And we know from Isaiah 61 that Jesus came to bind up the brokenhearted and exchange our shame and our hurt for his beauty and glory. So my hope in really practical terms is that the church will be naming violence against women as sinful, that the church will be a safe place to which victims of violence can turn to for safety and support and healing. I pray that churches will develop really secure, thorough safeguarding policies to make sure that nothing like this takes place in the church. And that we just, as a church, talk about this issue. But I've also been thinking, for myself, when I'm walking at night and I'm scared, or for my friends, what do I actually have to add to the conversation as a Christian right now, when there is a heightened sense of fear for women? And I'm slightly nervous about what I'm going to say, because I don't want it to come across as flippant. I don't want it to sound defeatist. But what I keep coming back to is that because I trust Jesus, my future is ultimately secure, whatever might happen on earth now. So if it's okay, can I read 1 Peter 1:3-6? It says this: "Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. In his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, and into an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade. This inheritance is kept in heaven for you, who through faith are shielded by God's power until the coming of salvation that is ready to be revealed in the last time. In all this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have to suffer grief in all kinds of trials." And it just comes back to the fact that trusting Jesus changes everything, even this. That even in the midst of fear, I can be secure, we can be secure, that we should absolutely be doing everything in our power to see change and to bring about justice. But because I trust Jesus, I have a future in him that can never perish, spoil, or fade. And that even though I might have fear, I have a hope that is much, much bigger.
Bekah, for anybody listening, affected by what happened to Sarah Everard, what may have happened to them or people close to them, people who want the church to be a place for change, for justice, what are some immediate next steps? What can we do next?
I think there's a few things we can do, and it kind of depends who we are, who we influence, and all those different things. We've all got our spheres of influence, even when we think that we don't. But I think there's a number of things. If you're a guy, ask the women around you to tell them their stories. Ask them. Not necessarily their nastier stories. They might not be comfortable sharing them, but ask them, have you experienced this? What does this look like for you? And really listen, without needing to comment or anything else, but just listen. And then maybe ask what you could do that would be helpful. because there are all kinds of things we can do. You know, and there are simple practical things which aren't the whole answer, but they're helpful. You know, there have been some top tips running around about, you know, if you're out jogging and you see somebody in front of you, who, you know, a woman in front of you, you know, the reality is you might know you're not a threat. You might be absolutely sure and quite defensive about how not a threat you are. But we have to remember that woman doesn't know that. She doesn't know that. All she can hear is steps running up behind her. And actually, if we cross the road at that point, that would really help. And there are other little things we can do just to stop and to think, what might somebody be going through at the moment? And I think in our churches, it's really important for us to have a little look inwards quickly and to say, are there any places where actually we are not speaking about women as respectfully as we could? Are there any places where actually we've allowed stuff to just go rumble on underneath, you know, and we haven't dealt with it? How as a church do we deal with topics of violence against women? When we work through the Bible, or we work through a book like Genesis, what happens when we get to the chapters which talk about sexual violence or violence against women? Do we skip over them, or do we actually stop and examine what God says about this? Do we make this a subject that we address, or is it one that we ignore because it's a bit difficult and it's hard to talk about? And then as parents, how are we raising our sons? How are we raising our daughters to view each other, to respect each other, to honor each other, to work together? Where are the conversations? How are we helping them navigate the really difficult world they live in? You know, with all the horrible stuff that's online, stuff they watch on television, the video, you know, the music videos that, you know, can sometimes have such negative messages. How can we not just protect them from it, because the reality is they'll come across it, but how can we have conversations with them to help them to understand it and put into a context of a world which is meant to be better? You know, it's all these things. And then how can we speak up? Just like Judges 19:30, how can we speak up when we see it in the world around us? We have a campaign called First Man Standing that encourages men to stand alongside women, you know, as brothers, partners, friends, and speak up when they see things that are wrong, to challenge friends. You know, just like hopefully we would challenge friends who said something racist, but would we feel as comfortable challenging them if they say something derogatory about women? Would we feel that that's an okay thing to do? Because actually we should be challenging people to speak up, to speak truth, and to speak kindly of each other. And as we begin to do those things, we'll begin to change the culture around us, and we can have an influence on however big that is, we can begin to make a difference. And, you know, and slowly but surely all these things begin to change.
So good. Bekah, how do people find out more about the work that you're doing with Restored?
Oh, you can find our website. We're restored-uk.org, and we're on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and places, so you can find us there as well. But restored-uk.org.
Thank you. Jo, Bekah, thank you so much for joining and sharing your experiences and your wisdom and your insight. In one respect, I hope this is the last time we have to have this conversation, but I have no doubt that we will need to have these conversations many times over. And I hope that as we continue to explore what justice looks like, what honouring women made in the image of God looks like, and changing the culture, I pray that we do it in step with God's Spirit. Bekah, why don't you pray for us to close?
Oh, I'd love to. Father, we just want to lift to you right now Sarah Everard's family and her friends and all those affected by this story. Words don't really begin to express everything that we want to say for them, but we know that you intercede on our behalf, and we just pray that you would be with them and help them to find the way forward in the midst of all that they're going through. But Father, I want to pray for us as church too, that as we see this story taking hold, as we see the horrors of the story, and then we begin to see the realities of the experience of so many women, not just in our family, in our neighborhood, and in our country, but actually around the world. I pray that you will stir in us that passion to bring your kingdom here on earth. You'll stir in us that righteous anger that says no more, not in our church, not in our community, not any longer. We want to see peace in this place, and that you would guide us in your infinite wisdom into the ways in which we can have influence, the ways in which we can bring your love and your honor and your goodness into the relationships that we see all around us. Help us to have the boldness to speak up where we see injustice, to speak up where we see people being put down and oppressed, and to help us to be your ambassadors here on earth. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, ladies. Take care and God bless.